Welcome to Pieces of Choice, the podcast where we explore how conscious awareness can help us cultivate inner peace and transform our lives. I'm Natasha Wallace, and in each episode we'll hear from guests about their personal journeys, the challenges they've faced, and how they've found greater levels of peace in their lives and positively impacted the lives of others. Today, I'm joined by someone who has spent the last few years helping business leaders rethink what truly drives success, based on a fresh and, some would say, disruptive approach. Paul Spiers is the founder of the new P&L Brand Purpose Institute and works across the UK, Europe and Australasia to help leaders embed values and clarity of purpose into how they operate, not just as a branding exercise, but as a way to build more resilient, responsible and engaged companies. Paul is also the host of the new P&L Principles and Leadership in Business podcast, where he speaks to guests about purpose in business. In fact, he's spoken to nearly 260 entrepreneurs, executives and changemakers over recent years. And Paul is currently preparing to release his first book, The New P&L Principles and Leadership, a 6-step framework where he draws on the insights he's gathered over years of interviews and research. In this episode, we'll explore what it means to lead with principles, why values and purpose matter more than ever in business, and we will also hear about Paul's own personal journey of learning and growth and how that led him to where he is today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Paul.
Pleasure. That introduction's probably more enjoyable than my responses, I think.
I'm sure that won't be the case. So we met recently at a business brunch that was organised by Matt Phelan from the Happiness Index, who has also been on the podcast, and I think he's been on yours, hasn't he?
Yes, yeah.
And we just happened to be sat opposite each other. I was thinking the other day that if we hadn't have been sat opposite each other, would we be here today? So I always think that sort of serendipity is lovely, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because we had the opportunity to have a bit of a chat, and then of course we met up in my favourite services, Gloucester Services in the UK, which is basically a big, huge farm shop, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
A couple of weeks ago. Yeah, really gorgeous place. And we were able to continue our conversation. And what was very, very noticeable about the couple of hours we spent together was that we went deep pretty fast.
Yeah, it was for 9 o'clock in the morning, it was a fairly wide-ranging conversation, I think. It was great. It was good.
Absolutely. Yeah. But also, don't you find sometimes you will have a conversation that just is deeper than usual, or that triggers some new thinking or some new insight, or, you know, evokes some emotion that you weren't even expecting to happen.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the point you made around serendipity, and serendipity sort of leads to curiosity, doesn't it? If you're listening with intent and conversing with real intention too. And I think that approach to curiosity, which I'm sure we'll come on to a few times in this conversation today, that's what leads to those deeper conversations, because we want to learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, I think, you know, the beauty of networking and getting yourself out there and putting yourself into new environments is that, you know, you meet new people, and it's an opportunity to expand your mind. And I can certainly say that talking to you has expanded my mind, and we've only spoken for a few hours. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where we go today.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
So let's start with discussing the new P&L. So it stands for Principles and Leadership, which is a bold reframe of the traditional profit and loss. What was the moment or experience in your personal journey that led to you setting the business up?
Yeah, so I've been an entrepreneur off and on for most of my life, various businesses, and holding senior positions in other organisations as well when I was in between those periods. And for a long time in the early 2000s, I had a brand reputation management and marketing agency. And about 2010, 2011, we were subject to a series of highly unethical actions from a client that took the business to its knees, and me personally to my knees at that point as well. In the middle of all of that, I just came up with an idea for a new P&L, that there essentially had to be a better way of doing business than what we had been subjected to in that moment. So a new P&L based on principles and leadership, not just profit and loss. And I think that's key as well. I'm not suggesting it's instead of, It's how we use principles in leadership to enhance the P in the traditional P&L, profit. So I held on to that idea, and I had to rebuild things and everything else, and I held on to that idea for a few years. And I didn't know what the vehicle was to deliver it, but it felt in my mind like a strong idea. And we all write down loads of rubbish ideas. I've got books and books of ideas that are going nowhere, but something about this stuck in my mind. And then about 2019, to your point, serendipity, I was sitting down for lunch with someone, and he said, I'm thinking of launching a podcast. And in that moment, something just went click, and I thought maybe that's the right vehicle to explore the new P&L. So I launched in October 2019. Then COVID hit in 2020, and we saw the void for many businesses between the words and the values and the actions that they espoused and that sat on their walls, and actually what they did when the shit hit the fan, when there was a crisis. There was a big gap, and we can all think of those brands who perhaps didn't live to the values that they had espoused. So that podcast really took off and grew exponentially. And that's really the background to it. And I'm still here now doing the podcast. The Institute was launched off the back of it. And increasingly over the last 3 years, keynote speaking in Europe and further afield around the role of purpose and leadership, but also how we prepare our culture, our leadership, our creativity in the age of AI.
And I mean, it's interesting that, to hear you had an idea, it was like a seed.
Yes.
But you didn't really know how you were going to bring it to life straight away. And actually you started small. Well, you didn't build a whole business out of it.
No, that's right.
You started with the podcast. And I think sometimes we can think that we need to make something, an all singing, all dancing, 20-page business plan. What made you feel comfortable starting small with the podcast?
It's probably a paradoxical piece of a lack of confidence to believe that, I can go from what I was doing to doing this. But then also I think it's a case of don't let, that old cliche, but don't let the good be the enemy of the great, or the great be the enemy of the good. You've got to start somewhere. If you saw this, unlike the professional setup we have today, if you saw the gaffer tape and frankly the real rudimentary approach to my first few episodes of the podcast, it was embarrassing. But I just felt there was something inherent in what that idea was, and I felt it came very close to where I was thinking in my life, and what I was looking to do, and so it felt right. Doesn't mean it's easy. That because you've found a purpose that opens the door, it doesn't enable you to go through it. You still have to do the hard work. But it just felt right, so I thought I would persist with it and see where it would take me.
And then what happened from there? How did the Institute grow from the podcast?
So over the first couple of years, we grew, as I said, very quickly, sort of turned into a top 5% global podcast. And I started having some of the audiences and those further afield in my network speaking to me about consultancy in that area. Could I come in and deliver workshops initially around leadership, culture and purpose? It started to flourish from there. We started to do a little bit of research, particularly around creativity. And that's where the Institute came from. So it was just really a coalescing of, my 35 years of experience in business anyway, and the various diverse things I've done in that, but also that diverse experience having a central focus and a central point for it all, which was how we bring all of these diverse things together under the banner of purpose and what that means for the vision and the strategy of a business.
And when you're working with organisations now, for the layman who hasn't come across your work yet, what are you actually doing? So
depends on what the requirement is, but generally I'm going in to assess the culture and the leadership within those organisations, where the great spots are, but also where perhaps the weaknesses are in that organisation, looking at the relationship between leadership and employees, the way that is delivered in the culture and the vision, how all of these things across the various elements, communication, strategy, leadership, operations, how they all synchronize, if you like. How does one fold and feed into another? There's no point having a wonderful vision, for example, if it's not replicated in the operations or it's not exemplified in the culture. That kind of, what does it look like at 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon? If you can't show me how those visions and values that are on the wall are demonstrated in the culture, there's a disconnect. So it's really essentially trying to join all of those elements together to have a commonality and focused on that vision and that purpose for that business.
And why do you think that the podcast became so popular? I mean, it clearly spoke to people. What do you think it is about it and about this, new P&L philosophy that you think people buy into?
Oh, if I knew that, I'd be driving a Learjet, not a Nissan Qashqai. I guess there was a timing element to it. As I said, it came on the other side of COVID, and then we saw lots of businesses not walking the talk through COVID and actually not looking after customers and stakeholders and employees the way they should have. Some did, some didn't. So I think there was a timing resonance there. I think people do want to explore. There's a simplicity, but I think a bit of inspiration to the name. The new P&L is enough of an intrigue to make people think, what is that about? People do want to find, and it means different things to different people, but people do want to find more purpose in what they're doing and leadership that has more vision than just their own vision, that has a vision for those around them as well in that organisation. So I think it was a lot of things that came together. I had some amazing guests and continue to have some amazing guests, which I guess provoked a lot of the interest as well, because it would, spark interest in their network. So a combination of things, I think, yeah. And I worked really, really hard doing my research for every guest to not push the same questions out to a very different person, but to actually really bespoke that conversation to that person. And I think that resonated both with the guest and with the audience as well, because it didn't become too formulaic, I think.
Yeah. And when we were talking the other day, you mentioned that you don't necessarily always work with every business that you start talking to, because there needs to be buy-in at the senior level to the work that you're doing. And certainly from the work that I do, often you need to see some courage amongst the senior leadership to be willing to challenge the status quo, do something different, go in a new direction, and also turn the mirror on themselves to say, oh, actually, it's maybe not quite as good as we want it to be. And that requires a little bit of self-confidence as a leader. And of course, this podcast is all about peace, which you would consider being about stillness and quietness. But actually, in the space that you're working in, it needs a lot of courage and values-driven action, forward movement, almost activism. How do we reconcile peace and the need for calm and, the need for us to steady ourselves with that drive for purpose and change, especially in business and leadership spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two sides to that. One is, you've correctly identified, in my view, at the beginning of that question, that this has to start with leadership. It has to start with leaders that are more self-aware, that are more conscious and aware in that moment of the impact of their actions and their words upon others. And that's why, as you alluded to, I turned down a couple of contracts last year because the leaders weren't buying into it. They only wanted me to do it with middle management. But I think it has to start at the top. Permission has to be given, either implicit or explicit, from leaders to be able to deliver this within an organisation. I think the other side of it is, in terms of peace specifically, in a lot of the keynotes I do, I talk about curiosity. It's a big thing for me. And I think there's a really clear red thread from curiosity to peace. If you're more curious as a leader or an individual, whoever it happens to be, it doesn't have to be a leader, but as an individual, if you're more curious, curiosity leads to knowledge acquisition, because you're looking out upon the world. You're asking why and what and how and what if and all those things. That expands your knowledge. If you expand your knowledge, you get closer to your purpose, because you eventually uncover, like I did with the new P&L, what your purpose is supposed to be in life. If you find your purpose, you find balance. And if you find balance, you're more inclined to find peace. So I think peace starts with curiosity, and that clear line of curiosity into knowledge, into purpose, into balance, and into peace. I guess the paradox with peace is it depends on how you define it, because peace for someone, as you said, it might be tranquility, but peace for someone else is peace of mind within themselves, that they are at the heart of that business, they're driving it, they love it, they're thriving, every day is buzzing and full of excitement. That might seem like the antithesis to peace, but for some people it is, because they found their purpose within that organization. So we need to be, I guess, careful, in my view, about how we define peace, that it's not tranquility, but it's finding that peace within ourselves in whatever shape or form that happens to come through purpose.
Yeah, I think that is just an incredibly powerful point to make. And also, I've been speaking to leaders recently quite a lot about the legacy they want to leave, because I think often leaders are worried about speaking up and challenging, their peers, I guess, or maybe the CEO who's doing things a certain way or has a certain vision or only wants to spend money on certain things, doesn't necessarily see that this sort of work is going to make a meaningful difference, or might be very, very short term in their thinking. And so that, these are often things that make a longer term difference.
Yeah.
So I've been talking to leaders about their legacy, because when you start thinking about the legacy you want to leave as a leader, suddenly it starts to help you think a little bit more about what your purpose is there. It's not just about putting out fires and making sure things don't fall over. It really is about making a difference. But I think often in leadership, we're just getting stuff done. We're so busy and we're just surviving, really. How do you help leaders to understand that they have a really important and significant role to play in shaping a purpose-driven culture?
I think that question and the legacy point are really, really interesting, because you can start from two different positions, and again, the old quote, where you start determines where you end up. And I think because we're driven in an influencer culture at the moment, there's a desire amongst some leaders, not all by any means, but some leaders to be that charismatic leader and that inspirational leader. But if we start with wanting to be that, to leave that legacy and everything else, I think we're starting from the wrong place, because we're starting from a place of ego, and charisma and inspiration is not given, it's perceived. There's a great, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, as you know, and there's a great Maori proverb that says the sweet potato does not speak of its own sweetness. And I think that applies to leadership as well. It's not about starting at the beginning, how do I become an inspirational, a charismatic, a legacy-led leader, but actually, how do I coalesce people around me in a purpose that is bigger than my own self-interest? What are we trying to do for this business? How are we trying to create products that leave a lasting impact, rather than just iterate and create a new product for the world? How do we make a difference in the world and make an impact in that world? So I think if we start with the legacy needs to be focused on the organization and what we are collectively going to leave behind. What does that vision look like for that organization that is outside my own self-interest as a leader? Actually, what are we trying to leave as an organization? And then how can I contribute to that as a leader by bringing people around me, by, again, that permission-led leadership, enabling people to be as innovative, as creative, as self-responsible as they need and can and should be, supporting people when they can't, encouraging that culture of collaboration. It can't be about me. That legacy has to be focused on the organization and the contribution I make, rather than that kind of legendary leadership that some of us seem to want to move towards because of that, that sort of celebrity status of some business leaders, I guess.
So one of the things we talked about when we last saw each other was about creation and innovation. And of course, an important part of your work is to build innovation, or to create a culture where people can innovate and create.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there's often some reticence, I guess, amongst leaders and managers to allow people to become too innovative or too creative, because it leads to risk, and also it can be a distraction from the day job. And something I didn't mention to you when we were together, which I really remember, but a couple of years ago, one of my team said to me, "You've got to stop talking to people." And I'll never forget it, because I am very curious. So I talk to people all of the time about the things I'm trying to solve. So I hear lots of voices. Now, I've always seen that as me just gathering data, and then, I'll pastiche all of that data together to make decisions. But from her perspective, I think she saw it as being a distraction. She said, look, or a threat.
Or a threat.
No, actually, yes, on reflection, it could have been a threat. So, I mean, she was basically saying to me, look, you know what you're doing. You don't need to keep on talking to lots of other people. Just get it done and just decide on what you're doing and stick with that route. Whereas I've just never been that type of person. But I think it's quite an interesting human reaction to change.
Yeah.
Where we're sort of constantly trying to, I think it's a very primal instinct, isn't it? We sort of want things to stay steady and stable, or at least for periods of time, we'd ideally like things to stay steady and stable. How do you deal with that, where you're going in and saying, well, let's innovate, let's change things, let's make things better and different?
There's a myth, I think, that in order for us to be creative and innovative, we just need the freedom, which is to your point, really, that, so there's this fear, I think, amongst management and leadership that if we open up that opportunity, everyone goes crazy and, someone's painting pictures in this room, someone's playing with Play-Doh in the other or whatever. But creativity needs, or innovation and creative thinking, which is the process that leads to innovation, needs both freedom and a framework. So we need the ability to have that freedom to come up with those ideas. But ideas are redundant without action. Intention is great. Ideas are wonderful. Intention is great. But it's only action that delivers. In order for action to deliver, it needs a framework. So unfettered creativity within an organization isn't always wise. But if we can create frameworks, which is what I try to help businesses do, to both release that creativity, but also ensure that it gets through the iteration process, through the testing process, and actually delivers something tangible, then I think that's where the solution is. Because I think the other side of it is, if we just open it up to creativity and people feel brave enough or bold enough to put their ideas forward, and it is brave and bold when you're a young person or a person in a starting role and you've been invited to give your ideas forward, we can't forget at our age and our level that actually it does take a lot of courage to do that. And if those ideas come forward and they don't go anywhere, then it's actually worse than not opening it up as well, because it becomes performative. There's that business, they're talking about creativity, they talk a good game. I gave up my best ideas and nothing went anywhere, So I think critical to that whole process is a framework to ensure that when we release that curiosity, we encourage that creativity, that actually there's a framework to deliver action and products and to ensure that those ideas have direction, they go somewhere. At the same time, I think there's this whole thing around ideas coming perfectly formed, and they don't. If you think about a potter and she or he picks up a lump of clay, that's an idea. That lump of clay is the genesis of an idea, and most of the ideas that we have are that lump of clay, but we have this expectation that idea should come fully formed. But actually what the potter does, or in collaboration with everyone else in business in that context, we shape that lump of clay into something beautiful. And then sometimes we get 2/3 of the way through it and we don't like it, so we squash it back down and we shape it back up again. But eventually we come up with that idea collaboratively through the organization. But it had to start with a lump of clay. And I think, again, because of the speed of business and the desire to just get something out and get it done and move on and do something else, and we've got to get shareholder value and blah, 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 there isn't a lot of consideration given to the fact that those ideas will not come fully formed. They will come as a lump of clay, and it's our responsibility within an organization to take that idea, the genesis of that idea that someone's proposed, build that framework around it, see what else might work, bring in other ideas and diverse life experiences and thoughts and business experience and wisdom and what's worked and what hasn't. And for the people who have been there for 30 years, asking someone who hasn't with a fresh set of eyes, what is that real solution to the problem? Shaping those things together and coming up with that idea together. Don't just think, well, it's a lump of clay, it didn't work, that's it. Creativity doesn't exist in the business. It's not an exact science, and it takes effort and it takes commitment and it takes resource. But the alternative is it also takes commitment, effort and resource to to manage a company that's declining and failing. So what do you want to apply your effort, resource and commitment to? Managing decline or managing innovation?
It's such an interesting point that you make, and the lump of clay, and how that sort of can look one way and then you squash the whole thing down and start again. Because I think a lot of us live in fear of squashing the clay back down again and starting all over. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about my conscious leadership journey. So I've been doing conscious leadership for like 8 years now. And it was the first time that these words ever left my mouth. So it was quite interesting to hear myself say it. But I said, I spent the first few years learning about my own model. So I came up with conscious leadership and the 5 underlying principles of conscious leadership and what it means and why it's important. And I did all the research and I published the book. But then it took me years to actually learn how to properly apply it. And I'm, 8 years later, it's morphing all of the time. And of course, it's morphing into this much wider personal transformation idea around peace. Peace is a choice. And, of course, the podcast is of that name, and the new book will be of that name. But actually now I'm looking at developing leadership programs built around calm leadership, peaceful leadership, how you can build and nurture organizations that feel like safe, thriving places to be through a slightly different lens. But that came through years and years of conscious leadership work, and
absolutely
trying that in lots of different guises. And actually, to some extent, I did take the clay and I built it into something, and I have sort of almost like knocked that back and rebuilt it many times, and I'm literally in the process of doing it again in probably the biggest way that I've ever done it. We've got to be really careful to not see that as failure.
100%, because the brain that you have and the thinking, the experience and the wisdom you have today is not what you had when you started this journey. So of course things should evolve because they evolve with your own learning. And, exactly the same thing is happening with the new P&L. We don't want to be pushing out the same thing year after year after year. What would that demonstrate? It's antithetical to what we're trying to achieve, which is consciousness, which has always been conscious of yourself in that moment and how you learn and you grow. To roll out the same old program for 8, 10 years or whatever is antithetical to that, to the very rationale that you and I exist.
Yeah, fair point. Well said. Another thing that happened when we were together a couple of weeks ago is that you asked me a couple of questions that actually floored me. Really stopped me in my tracks. Questions or observations as well that I hadn't made about my own life, because because we went deep quickly, we obviously were talking about our own personal journeys to some extent, and it really did speak to the power of reflecting on your own personal journey, but also having somebody who asks you a question that you've never necessarily thought about before, or it gives you another opportunity to revisit it. And I wanted to take the time to do that today, because we touched on your personal journey when we were together, and I know that you've been on a big journey. Can you tell us a little bit about it and the challenges that you've faced, and what you've learned from that journey that shaped your life view?
Yeah, I think just before I do, I'd probably say that everyone's got that journey, haven't they? We look at certain people who talk about the rags to riches or whatever it happens to be, but everyone has that shit in their lives. Everyone carries a burden of some description. So mine's not exceptional, it's not any different to anyone else's. But, I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as I said. There are very few books that we had I was one of 7, and there were very few books in our house, and for various reasons. And I think the story I told you, I won an encyclopedia when I was 7 years old in a local raffle. And that was the only book I had at that point. But that book entirely changed my life, because it opened my eyes, literally and figuratively, to the world. My curiosity was sparked. I wanted to learn more and more and more. And everything I think I've done since. And when I launched the new P&L, which I feel is, and this is probably another point actually, I didn't launch this till I was 51, 5 years ago. And this is my entire life's work coming together in my head, but it took me to 51 to figure it out, so I'm a very slow learner. But for people in their 40s thinking that the opportunities pass them by, it never does. It's just be more, to your role, more conscious about it. But when I look back with the new P&L, I'm at the intersection of knowledge acquisition and inquiry and curiosity and creativity and speaking to amazing people and learning from them. And I look back to that 7-year-old kid, I can draw a direct red thread back, to what that book gave me and everything that I'm doing now. But it took me another, 42 or 3 odd years to get from that point to there. But conversely, everything I've done in my career, and it's been a very, very, very diverse career. I was a pastry cook's apprentice at 15, and there's been loads of different things since before I found, the marketing agency I did and so on. But everything I can actually look at, and it's given me something for the new P&L, whether it's diverse life experience or, certain professional skills that are maybe 20, 30 years old, but actually I'm still utilizing them now in some shape or form. So I described it to someone the other month as, I think for my entire career, I was standing in the right field, but looking the wrong way. And when I turned around, when I launched the new P&L, I turned around and realized I was supposed to be running for the other try line. So the correlation of skills and the combination curation of skills were all there, but I just couldn't quite see where I was supposed to be, and the new P&L made me turn around and realize I was going that way, not the other way.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty profound. And it's also making me wonder about the role that your sort of unique talents and gifts play in all of this. And I know you're probably one of the most humble people I've ever met. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that you, like blowing your own trumpet, but certainly in the work that I do, everybody's got these unique talents and gifts.
Absolutely.
Or that they connect to them and realize that they're there, then actually the more aligned they become. What talents and gifts or characteristics, I guess, do you have that now support you in the work that you do?
Pass.
I knew you'd say that.
To your point on everyone having those unique characteristics, that's something I think leaders forget, that, we look at an organization and we think our organization is largely the products or the services we sell. That's our unique identifying point. But if we're really honest with ourselves, most of the services most organizations sell or products pretty much like the others. And even those that do have some unique features, I don't know, the, mobile phone or whatever, most of those features we don't even utilize in many of these technologies. So actually the real unique proposition within your organizations is the unique combination of people, life experiences, thinking, creativity that exists within that organization at any given point in time, because no other organization can replicate that, because those people cannot be replicated in another organization. The one down the road's got the same, the one down the road's got the same. So how do you tap into that unique set of attributes and characteristics and skills and creativity and innovation that exists just beneath the surface? How do you cut into that veneer, and actually release all of that? Because it's not the products and services, it's the people, but you've got to be able to create frameworks to release that uniqueness. And we don't, we're just quite often too busy treating people as automated tools rather than creative geniuses, which most are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And I also think that we can turn our experiences into our purpose. I mean, that's definitely what happened to me when I had my burnout experience 8 years ago, and then realized, through lots and lots of personal development work, that I'd been through some difficult trials. And rather than seeing them as being, some tragic story, I thought, actually, why don't I just help other people? So, because we all go through this stuff, as you say, we all have been on a journey. We all carry things from our past that were difficult. And some of us get stuck in that, or we don't necessarily know how to process it or deal with it. And it influences the course of our life and the way that we feel and the way we see each other. or see ourselves. So, I thought we'll sort of turn the pain into purpose, I guess. And I think you've done a similar thing, haven't you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Taken your life experiences and turned them into your purpose. But one thing I wanted to talk to you about was self-judgment, because I think when you go through personal trials, there's often a voice of self-judgment or fear, which I think is why we avoid, failure so much. We avoid squashing the clay figurine back down again, because what does that mean about us in terms of, were we good enough, did we fail? What have you learned about self-acceptance on this journey yourself, and how has that influenced you?
I think the key is finding the line between self-evaluation and self-judgment. Self-judgment's a negative, self-evaluation is critical for growth, isn't it? And it's trying to figure out, because we're all different, obviously, where that line is for each of us. Where the important and purposeful evaluation sort of tips over into indulgent and very negative self-judgment. And often, again, paradoxically, we don't really know where that is until we're probably in a period of self-judgment, and we're either able to pull ourselves out through whatever mechanism, or we look back on it and think, gosh, actually I was really hard on myself through that period. But we do, there's no scientific answer to this, because I think we do have to be a little hard on ourselves sometimes. We do have to take personal responsibility for some things, or for our role in things, even if it was a passive responsibility, even if we let it happen to us or weren't responsible enough to address it rather than being the active agitator in it. Some of us still allow ourselves to be in situations. So I think that evaluation of whatever the situation is and whatever wrong has been visited upon you, so to speak, what was your active role in it, and how do you change that to ensure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to what extent do you think you've had to give yourself a bit of self-compassion over the years?
Yeah, well, my dad he was a stoic old Kiwi builder, not prone to emotion at all. Right. And when I had a business years ago in New Zealand, and I was bemoaning the fact that, something wasn't working in it or whatever, I would have been in my 20s then. And he just looked up and he just said, if you're not dead, it's not over. And that's his philosophical advice for my life. And I think it's kind of true. Rather than self-compassion for me, it's about how do I take this and move on and move forward and learn. And you've got to be a bit kind to yourself, but equally you do. Sometimes I think, and this might be not a popular view, but sometimes we also sit in it a bit too much. And compassion tips over into excuse, I think, self-compassion sometimes. So sort of circling right back to your point on finding peace, I think, again, that is a challenge for me in my head, because if you find it and you find true peace, where do you go from there for the next 20 or 30 years of your life? Life is an entire, it's a cliche again, but you've got to be learning, don't you? That's the key part of life, to learn, to grow, to not be the same person when you die as you were when you were 20 or 30 or 40, to be more positive, have more wisdom, have more compassion for others, and empathy and understanding and knowledge and all of those things. So if we find peace, what do we then do with that peace? Because it can't be the end of the journey.
A lot of people would say that it's an impossibility to reach that point. Well, not an impossibility, but it's sort of reserved for the very few. Maybe the Dalai Lama has truly reached the point where he's at peace all of the time. Yeah. It feels like it's quite a movable feast. And actually, I would argue, going back to your point, that you can't achieve peace on a regular basis unless you're curious and learning. They sort of go hand in hand.
It's also context dependent, isn't it? You can have peace now, but something may upend your life, and then, that's finding peace again through that. So, but that should be, same as transformational leadership. You don't become the transformed leader the recognition is in the journey that you're always, or the fact that you're always on that road towards becoming a transformational leader. You don't ever get to the end of it. And I guess it's the same for peace. How do we find where we're always challenged? The world isn't static, as you suggest. We're always put into situations where we may have been good yesterday and it's difficult today for whatever reason. So the challenge is to continually find new ways to hack the system, I guess, to get closer to where you feel there is a balance.
Yeah, and I think even just the realization that we're all on the same journey and that we're all feeling similar things, and we all have good days and we all have bad days, and that's just a very human experience. I think it's probably quite liberating.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's carrying something, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you could go back then to sit with your younger self, what would you say to him about, peace, purpose, and trusting the journey?
So Matt, our friend, asked me this on his podcast, and I think I would give the same advice. Surf more and worry less. I think that would be my advice. That's trying to make it my mantra.
When we were at that brunch, Matt said that the only reason he'd really started to think about peace was because he was coming on my podcast and he had to get his head around what it meant.
Yeah.
And that he started a conversation amongst us as a group around football. I think he plays football, and it's only when he plays football that he sort of transcends all of the madness and actually achieves any level of peace. Do you think it's the same for you when it comes to surfing?
It's 100%. I can tell you the first wave I got. I can tell you where it was and how old I was. I can tell you so many moments in my life. If I put aside from the kids, let's say, so many moments, some of the best moments in my life are sitting out the back, surfing. Now I do surf with the kids as well, so they've become part of that memory on that side as well. But sitting out the back of waves, with friends, and perfect days or really early mornings and catching great waves, and that is where my peace is found, because there is actually there's a very meditative spiritual element to surfing when you're sitting out the back and you're one with nature, and then it's punctuated by these moments of incredible adrenaline when you catch the wave and get a good wave, get a bad wave, get held under, whatever, but then you pop out the other side, you paddle back out, and then you're sitting out the back again in this sort of semi-spiritual meditative state. So it's the most wonderful thing for me. Yeah, that's where I find my peace for sure, apart from the family.
Yeah, of course. And it sounds like there's something about getting out of your head.
Yeah.
And just being present.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything's, if you're surfing or Matt playing football, when you're in that moment, you're just in that moment, isn't it? And that's the important thing. That's what, for me, surfing does. When I have to paddle and catch the wave and get on the wave, you can't afford to have your mind focused anywhere else apart from don't fall off. So it's an incredible focus that I wish I could bring into my procrastinating afternoons of work.
Yeah, well, indeed. And of course, they talk about mindfulness and staying in the moment, and that probably is the place where you can find the most peace. But of course, we're constantly darting off to, I've got to do this, and what if this happens? And oh no, that conversation. A final question about your past, really, or your heritage. So you were born in New Zealand. You have Irish, English, and Maori heritage.
Yeah.
How's that global insight fed into your approach to life and your own leadership philosophy?
It's an interesting question. I guess it wouldn't be so much that heritage, although certainly on the Maori side, because I'm exploring more and more of it now, that is opening up a whole world to me in terms of the Maori outlook on life. But I think coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and coming to Europe, and it's certainly by no means unique because lots and lots of people do, but it has given me a different experience, of a different perspective of the way I see business. Growing up the way we did in a fairly tough environment, it's given me another perspective. When I was 17 to 22, I was a professional musician in New Zealand, and because of the music we played for a lot of gangs, motorcycle gangs and various other gangs, and that whole experience plays a big role actually in why I try to unlock creativity because and within businesses, because I spent a lot of time with those gang members over the 5-year period, and there was obviously all of the usual things associated with gangs, but what I really did notice in many of them that I spoke to was they had incredible levels of entrepreneurship and curiosity and creativity and innovation. In the absence of the opportunity of sometimes legal means, they turn their hand to other ways, but they had the same amount of curiosity and creativity that all of us have, but what they didn't have was opportunity for whatever reason, because they'd come out of dysfunctional families sometimes and had challenging environments, and they'd found a sense of belonging in those gangs. But it really formed a lot of what I did with my creative agencies, marketing agencies, and it certainly forms what I do now, that so much of the potential that exists within our organizations exists just below the surface. And if we could just find ways to unlock that opportunity, to bring it forward, to have the freedom and the framework, as I said earlier, actually there's so much to be discovered within the one-dimensional person that we perceive that employee to be. We can just cut beneath the surface, then that three-dimensional employee comes out with all of those ideas and their perspectives and everything else, their rich life experiences that they can contribute. You know, we employ someone for a role, we ask them to be the full person at work, and then we slot them into that role and ensure that they only deliver that role. There is so much more that can be contributed if we'd only give the permission and put the process in place and build the purpose for that business to deliver that.
Yeah, I think that's such a valuable point. And I've often thought throughout my life that if you could see somebody, if you could look at them and they were sort of hollow, you could see through them to see all their life experiences and, the difficult parenting they experienced, or the loss of, a sibling, or, whatever it is, or where they've tried really hard to achieve but failed because of the background they came from, or whatever, all of those experiences that have led them through life. If we could see the makeup of everybody right in front of us when we met them, I just think that would lead to a much more compassionate and accepting world. But of course, we don't look under the surface often, and I think that's what leads to many of the problems that we're facing in the world now.
But that starts with curiosity as well, doesn't it? That starts with wanting an intention, having that intention to learn, to want to learn from each other, to understand who the whole person is within our organizations, to putting the process. There's a point I make in a couple of my keynotes. I talk about turning on the intergenerational knowledge tap. We've got 5 generations about to come into organizations at scale, from boomers to alpha. It's an extraordinary amount of wisdom and knowledge and inspiration and creativity and technological prowess and everything else. If we can only find a way to bring all of those generations together and let them learn from each other in a non-hierarchical environment, not women and men my age pontificating on their 35 years in business, but actually bringing it together in a non-hierarchical way. Yeah. The companies that will do that successfully will have a massive competitive advantage, I believe. And, there's research that demonstrates that, but it's how we find ways to unlock that, turn on that intergenerational knowledge tap, bring people together, not just to work, but to learn, to ask questions of each other in a non-judgmental, non-hierarchical way.
Absolutely. I actually spoke to somebody yesterday, somebody I'm coaching, and he sits on the board of a charity, and on that board they've got young people. And he said it's the most challenging board he's ever sat on, because those young people, one, they're encouraged to speak up, but 2, they really do. And he said they will really challenge us and really get us to reflect on what we're saying and what we're thinking. And I thought, of course. I mean, of course they would. And it's just such I loved hearing him talking about it. But, we do need to bring the generations together a bit more.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, I could continue forever, I think, asking you questions about you yourself and what you do. But for those people who want to find out a little bit more about you, where should they look?
So you can either go to LinkedIn, Paul Spiers, and thank you so much for getting my name right. Most people call me Spiers, so I really appreciate the fact that you got Spiers, Spiers. You find me on LinkedIn or principlesandleadership.com, and you can contact me there or check out the site and all the rest of it.
Fantastic, lovely. Thank you so much, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Peace is a Choice. For any information on what we've covered in today's episode and to connect with my guests, head to the show notes. It would be great if you could rate and review the podcast and subscribe now so you don't miss out on any future episodes.